Hello everyone, welcome to my YouTube channel. So today I'm going to be talking to us, as a continuation of the video that I've made regarding immunohistochemistry in histopathology. Okay, so we had already looked at immunohistochemistry. We've looked at the fact that in some cases there can be some conditions that could lead to post-staining in immunohistochemistry. So, and the common question they ask in histopathology is, when that is noticed, what could cause that, and what will be the solution to that? Meaning, how can we be able to correct that? So I hope, and I told you guys, I've given you guys the list already, and I said I'm going to be taking the point one after the other. That way, at least, just to keep it simple and help us for easy understanding. So before we continue, my name is Dr. Emmanuel Obodo. I'm a biomedical scientist, and I'm also a lecturer in biomedical science here in the United Kingdom. So yeah, let's get into this. Now, the first thing that I mentioned to you guys, and I think I should actually lay a little background before I say this, okay? So I want you guys, I already told you guys about immunohistochemistry. It has to do with the antigen antibody, because we use antibody to detect the antigen, okay, on the tissue, as the case may be. Let me tell you something that you may not be aware, because this will help us as we progress in this topic, okay? I want you to know that anytime you are doing immunological tests, anytime the test you are doing is based on immune system, is based on antigen antibody in any form, because this can also be commonly seen in immunology, okay? When you are doing any techniques that has to do with the antibody detecting antigen, there are processes that are involved, okay? Now, one of the common processes has to do with, there has to be primary antibody, okay? And then there has to be secondary antibody. Now, it is these two antibodies that can help for effective binding of the antigen, okay? I'm just trying to give a background. Now, one other aspect of that to ensure that, because remember, we want the antibody to bind to the specific antigen, because antibody should be specific to its antigen. But I'm sure you should be aware as a scientist that sometimes there can be some, maybe other proteins or artifact or something that could mimic, anything that may mimic the normal, anything that may mimic the targeted antigen would make the antibody to bind on that thing. And when antibody bind to something that is not the main antigen, but that mimic that very antigen, that is called non-specific binding. And what it means that when such a thing happens, you are not going to get accurate results, okay? Now, another thing you're going to find out in immunology, like antigen antibody detecting antigen, is that there has to be blocking. So in order to prevent this non-specific binding, we can do blocking. That blocking helps to inhibit or cover the possibility of anything else that the antibody may bind on, may detect. Does that make sense? So that's why we do blocking. Another thing you need to notice, if we do blocking, it is important that we wash very well. So there's also washing, okay? So these things are the reasons that these are the common protocol that are involved when you are doing any kind of immunological testing, okay? Like we're talking about immunohistochemistry now, or maybe ELISA, or Western blotting, or even flow cytometry. These are common. So there has to be the sample you want to use. So in immunology, it's either you're using antigen to detect antibody, or you're using antibody to detect antigen. So whichever way, there has to be a primary sample that you are using, and then there has to be maybe, of course, primary antibody or primary antigen or primary or secondary antibody or secondary antigen, as the case may be. But in most cases, it's the antibodies that we're using, okay? Now, so there has to be that, and of course, there has to be blocking, and of course, there has to be washing, right? So having said this, I want you to also know that in that way, if there has to be sample, because you want to detect antigen, now, that protocol, there is a minimum amount of the antigen it can be able to detect. Let me just give you an example. Because when we talk sciences like this, it can, I don't want you to be wondering a lot of things. Let's use in terms of degree. Let's use degree, just to make it simple. Let's say that the antibody can detect an antigen that has about 10 degrees, okay? What it means that if the sample has 5 degrees of the antigen, it may be difficult for that antibody to detect it. Not because it didn't bind it, but there is not enough antigen that can give you results. I hope that makes sense, okay? So meaning that there has to be an adequate amount of antigen and there has to be adequate amount of antibody. Those two adequacies will then bind to give you the result. I said this because one of the first points that I wrote down here that could affect, immunohistochemistry, leading to immunohistochemistry post-staining is what we call inadequate antigen retrieval. Inadequate antigen retrieval. What do I mean that? Okay, inadequate means is not enough. Antigen, of course, is a protein, okay, maybe found on that very tissue. Retrieval means we are not able to get enough of it, okay? Now, what then happened, just to give you a background, sometimes if there is maybe how will I call it now, maybe if there is issues with the fixation, okay, about 10% formaldehyde, okay, so if we fix the tissue and there are issues around the fixing, okay, maybe the fixing maybe perhaps could be under-fixed or maybe over-fixed, as the case may be. So what happened is that this very fixative, okay, depending, could max, it could cover the antigen, the epitopes of that very antigen. And when this very fixative cover the epitopes of the very antigen, it then makes it difficult for that antibody to be able to bind to that antigen. Does that make sense? Okay. So what then happens is that because that very fixative has masked the antigen, it will be difficult for the antibody to bind, and that can lead to the post-staining. You see it now? Not because there is something wrong with the staining, but because the fixative has masked the epitope of that very antigen and making it difficult for the antibody to be able to bind to its targeted antigen. And that is what can make it difficult. So because that is the case, what we then need to do is to find a way to retrieve that antigen. Therefore, how do we then retrieve the antigen? Because if the antigen retrieval is not done very well, it's not because the antigen is not there, don't forget. It's just that the fixative has masked it, has covered it. So we need to find a way to remove the fixative and expose the antigen. So if we don't do it properly, there can be weak staining, or it can even be absent. It will show you negative and you wouldn't know that the antigen is there. So now I have said number one, what that lead to poor IHC staining is inadequate antigen retrieval, and I've given you guys the background. So because you already know what the cause might be, then what will be the solution? Now, if you want to remove the fixative or any other factor that may have masked the antigen, you may need to explore heat. Okay, so we now need to use heat-induced method. So this heat-induced method would then help to remove, kind of dislodge these very marks. Okay, so the heat can then dislodge the marks. Maybe we can make use of maybe something like a microwave, or you can make use of something like water bath, as the case may be. You can even have a water bath, okay, buffer, okay, such as the one that maybe contains citrate or EDTA, as the case may be. So that will help to dislodge anything that may have masked that very antigen. I hope that makes sense. So that way it can be able to expose the antigen for proper staining, okay, for proper binding by the antibody. So I've mentioned that the solution will be to induce heat, okay, employ heat-induced method to dislodge that very marks. Okay, now another thing is that when it comes to that very marksing, you might need to employ enzyme retrieval. So you can use enzyme retrieval. So there are some enzymes, use of protease, okay, these protein enzymes, okay, that can help to retrieve the antigen. So what is going to do that it will remove that very marksing and retrieve that very antigen. Okay, one of the common one, of course, I have used myself is what we call trypsin, okay, trypsin, which is TRYPSIN, trypsin. And sometimes you can also use what we call proteinase K. Now, anyway, trypsin is a common one, okay, that people use. So trypsin is a kind of enzyme, okay. It will help to, dislodge, digest that very marks. And once it digests the marks, it can then, once it digests the marks, it can then expose, okay, that very antigen. And that exposure of that very antigen will now ensure that the required concentration for that antibody to detect that antigen, because then that antigen that has been exposed will then become enough for the antibody to be able to bind. Now, it's also important that when you are doing this, you are very, very careful with that, because if the enzyme digests, too much digestion can also lead to the destruction or maybe affecting the morphology of what you are looking for. Anyway, inadequate antigen retrieval, is one of the problems that causes IHC poor staining. The solution is to employ heat-induced method and of course employ enzyme retrieval. I hope that makes sense. Let me know what you think about the video. Please, can I ask you to like, share, subscribe? Thank you very much till I come back here again. Bye.